Overcoming Racism to Build a True Democracy. We're going to wait about 30 seconds to allow others to join. And then afterwards, I will proceed with introductions. So please be patient with us. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Guy Uriel-Charles, and I'm the Charles Ogletree Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. And I want to start with a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. The Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Today's event is being recorded, and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of this event. Please send them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via chat. It is now my distinctive pleasure to welcome all of you and our two amazing authors to this conversation on overcoming racism to build a true democracy. I will first introduce the speakers, and then I'll provide some framing comments, and then we'll turn to hear from our great speakers. We're lucky to have join us this afternoon in conversation Theodore Roosevelt Johnson. Mr. Johnson is the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work explores the role that race plays in electoral politics, issue framing, and disparities in policy outcomes. Previously, he was a national fellow at New America and a research manager at Deloitte. He is also a retired commander in the US Navy following a 2-decade career that included service as a White House fellow, military professor at the US Naval War College, speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, and his debut book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, was published earlier this year and is the topic of our conversation. It outlines a path toward a multiracial national solidarity to finally overcome the existential threat of racism in the United States. We'd like to welcome Dr. Johnson to our conversation this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Our second speaker who will be in conversation with us is Heather McGhee. She's an expert in economic and social policy. She's also the former president of the inequality-focused think tank Demos. Ms. McGhee has drafted legislation and testified before Congress. She now chairs the Board of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization. She holds a BA in American Studies from Yale and a JD from Berkeley. Her new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, it has spent 10 weeks on the New York Times bestseller. Ms. McGhee, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
So first, let me just provide some framing comments on these two amazing books and these two amazing authors. So what I found, I read a lot of books, especially a lot of books about race, and I have to say these are, it was a pleasure to read your books. These are some of the most interesting and engaging books that I've read, quite frankly, in a long time. The writing was tremendous. The stories that both of you tell and your personal stories as well as interwoven within the book, I think was fabulous. And part of what I also find interesting is the commonality between the two. So just a few words on that, and then I will turn it over for you to tell us about your books and why you wrote them and what the lessons are that you want us to learn, and then we could have a broader conversation. So at the broadest level of generality, both books are about obviously the role of racism in the American system, but much more specifically, how racism makes all of us worse off, right? Not just say African Americans or people of color, but the whole country, the whole polity worse off. And that if we don't address racism, we can't advance together as a country. So part of what I found interesting is that argument that in order for us to advance as a country, we need to address racism. Both books also make a point of talking about collective solidarity. Ted, you called it a civic religion. Heather, you talked about the importance of solidarity as a way of building community and maybe as a way of focusing against the racial appeal, but toward the things that bind us and bring us together. And both books are also interested in fulfilling the American promise. And in some respects, there's an optimism and a positivity in both books, at least that I perceived, and I'd be curious to see if that is true as the author, if that's part of the intent, that the books your projects each try to take the American promise and make it real for everyone, and that there's a belief in the American promise and the American framework and system as a whole, notwithstanding the racism that the book obviously talks about and is concerned about. And then lastly, what I think is interesting for me, as in some ways perhaps even unusual, that it seems that to me that the books harken back to the old liberal conception and ideals of civic republicanism, of solidarity, maybe to some minor extent, individualism combined with a collective sense and collective identity. But that's what I got out of reading sort of these tremendous projects. But more importantly, I want to hear from the two of you why you wrote these books and what you want us to take out of them, and then we can engage in other sets of questions. So I don't know, Heather, if you want to go first, and then Ted, if you'll follow, I would appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Guy, for agreeing to host this conversation, to the Ash Center, to my mentor, Miles Rappaport, at the Ash Center. Really, really appreciate being invited to celebrate Ted's book, which I think is what we're really here for. And I'm looking forward to hearing him talk about it. But I will say that I set out to write The Sum of Us about four and a half years ago, out of a sense that the tools that I'd been honing, for nearly 2 decades working at a think tank, research, statistical analysis, crafting evidence-based policy solutions, getting those solutions in front of policymakers and business leaders through lobbying and testimony and advocacy, and hoping that they would make better economic decisions. That whole sort of feedback loop was not working with the urgency and consistency that I thought was necessary given the rapid rise of economic and political inequality in America. And that there simply wasn't a good explanation in my field of policy analysis for why, put simply, we can't have nice things. And why it is that this country, with the incredible might and wealth that it has, with the legacy of having invented something called the American dream, having created through smart policy decisions the greatest middle class the world had ever known, was so hell-bent on turning its back on that formula and was so singularly stingy to itself, and why we were hurtling towards a new kind of American exceptionalism with inequality and insecurity as the hallmark, where we are way outside of our OECD peers in terms of really critical life and death outcomes around child poverty, maternal mortality, around how much we spend on the basic needs of our people. And that had been sort of premised on a bet that the private sector could take up the slack, but with wages stagnant and declining, in real terms, with 40% of adult workers being paid too little to meet their basic needs, while 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, for example, it wasn't working. And yet the sort of course correction was not happening. And consistently across the sort of logic of the headwinds, these sort of invisible headwinds that were making it hard for good, sound policy to be made in the interest of the broad public, were racist stereotypes and were the vestiges of explicitly systemic racism in much of our policymaking. And so I set out on a journey across the country. I went, it was a whole series of trips from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times. And it was an attempt to try to listen to different voices, to piece together a more convincing story than the story that I had sort of learned in the kind of economics orthodoxy about what really leads to economic change. And it was a story that really found the fingerprints of racism in our politics and our policymaking. And the central metaphor at the heart of the book is the story of the drained public pool. And that's both an historical fact, what happened when well-funded, lavish, grand resort-style, often WPA, New Deal public pools that were often segregated all over the country were forced by court orders in the late 1950s to integrate. Many towns and cities drained their public pools rather than integrate them. And that was both an historical fact, literally draining out the water, backing up truckloads of dirt, seeding it over with grass in places like Mississippi, obviously, but also in places like Washington State and Ohio and New Jersey. And this phenomenon, for me, helped give me a very vivid visual to explain the break that happened in the late 1960s and 1970s in the social contract that had created a high wage, high taxation, high public investment, sort of public goods driven ethos that had created that great middle class in the American dream, but with a racial asterisk. And in the book, I talk about how, like the pool, so many of the public goods of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, from housing to the GI Bill to Social Security to the strong enforcement of collective bargaining rights, were either explicitly or in practice racially exclusionary. And that the core question of, can we swim together? Can we have public goods even for a public that white people had been taught were not good? Was the question that the country, particularly its white citizens, were ambivalent at best and hostile at worst too. And that really helps explain a lot of the ways in which, whether it's healthcare, the funding for public college, the threadbare social safety net, the unwillingness to update our welfare state to the way families exist now, to not be outliers on things like paid family leave and childcare, that racism in our politics, often through dog whistle politics, the politics of racial resentment, is sort of an uncredited actor in the story. Just to close here, on the hopeful note on which the book ends, and also the note on which a word from labor past, which is getting quite a focus here in our conversation, solidarity. That becomes therefore the answer. If zero sum thinking, if tribalistic thinking that eschews collective action out of a anxiety or hostility towards the idea of a diverse public is the problem, then cross-racial solidarity is the answer. And I began to think of these gains that we could unlock in terms of cleaner air and higher wages and better funded schools, and these stories that I was uncovering across the country as solidarity dividends, as mutual gains for white folks and people of color, for whole communities that put aside the sort of self-sabotaging thinking. And it's that story of cross-racial solidarity and the dividends that can come from it that I think is where our country is heading. And fits and starts with predictable and well-funded backlash, as every moment of racial justice has faced. But I do believe that is where we are headed.
Thank you, Ted, if you wouldn't mind. And then we can, one question I'll have both of you will be about, to what extent is racism itself the commonality? And is it possible to replace it? But Ted, please tell us how you came to this project and tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so thank you to the Harvard's Ash Center for pulling this together, to you, Guy, and to Miles for arranging it, and to you, Heather, for being here with us. I loved your book, and I'm just so happy to be in your company. I set out to write this book. It actually began as my dissertation that I finished in 2016 that was about Black American political behavior. And in political science, it's the political behavior of Black Americans is usually characterized by the theory of linked fate, or an idea from the University of Chicago professor Michael Dawson, who suggested that the reason you see such uniformity in the way Black Americans vote isn't because there's uniformity in our ideology or in our political stances, but because the group interest sort of requires a solidarity in order for us to ensure that us as individuals can enjoy the fullness of the American promise. And so Black solidarity just became an idea that was incredibly interesting to me. And I started thinking, what is it? Why does it have to be contained to just the Black experience? For as much as Black Americans have made our nation better, wouldn't the nation do well to pick up from some of the lessons of Black solidarity, such that we could incorporate it across racial lines in order to compel the nation state to be responsive to the people, as the Declaration of Independence suggests, where it says that we have a government that derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. So I started thinking about, is there a kind of linked fate that has a national application? And if there is, how in the world could we build it when racism has been such a useful and successfully employed tactic to divide Americans since the very moment this nation, but before the moment it was established, and certainly ever since? And so I started to sort of pull back some of these threads. And I think the main insight was that even when we fought a civil war with 1 million casualties and passed constitutional amendments that made formerly enslaved Black people citizens and allowed at least the Black men to begin voting, within a decade, that right had been stripped away. And then it was not until the 1960s that the voting rights of many Black folks in the Deep South were restored. And so why is it that we can fight wars, pass constitutional amendments, executive orders, Supreme Court hearings from Dred Scott to Plessy to Brown v. Board, and new legislation, and we're revisiting the same topic about how can we incorporate Black people into this country? How can Black folks enjoy the constitutional protections that have been extended to so many others for so long? And I realized that public policy is incredibly important to the American project, but if there's not a change in national character, then whatever policies we pass will not achieve the desired outcome, because those who desire a marginalized or those who desire a hierarchical America will always find loopholes in the things that we do in order to ensure that their social status is protected at the expense of other folks that are their fellow citizens, their fellow Americans. So the book is it dives into political science and history and sociology and philosophy, and weaves those with just sort of a little bit of a polemic about the state of the country. But it doesn't just talk about the frameworks. It also connects to my family's journey in America, from my 3 times great-grandfather who was enslaved in Florida and Georgia, all the way through to my service in the military, to put flesh and bone on some of these theories and concepts, but also to show that even in the worst of times, there was a faithful and optimistic people who've compelled the nation to change its behavior. Emancipation was not a gift to Black folks. It was the product of our work and our energy. The end of Jim Crow was not the result of epiphanies across white America that was then gifted to Black folks. It was the product of our energy and our work and our patriotism. So the book makes basically one central argument with 3 points. The first is that structural racism is an existential threat to America. And I say structural racism in particular because I want people to immediately put aside the idea that we're trying to change people's hearts and that we have to love one another and kumbaya before we can create a better country. And I think attacking structural racism with good public policy will lead us to be the better country that we hope to be. And I also make a distinction between America and United States, the geopolitical nation state United States. We know in our nation's history that the nation state has lived quite comfortably sometimes with rampant, explicit racism coursing through the nation. But the ideals of America, encapsulated in the second paragraph of the Declaration, that we're all created equal, that we have these unalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that is not compatible with racism. It's not compatible with racial inequality. So either we are a nation that pursues these principles and structural racism recedes, or we're a nation that allows structural racism to perpetuate and maybe to be exacerbated. And in doing so, the American idea begins to die because it proves that we're not sufficiently committed to it. The second part of the argument is that the only way out of this is to create solidarity across racial lines. And this is a point that Heather's book makes beautifully, that we all benefit when we require the state to stop being in breach of the social contract by not sufficiently addressing structural racism. And the only way we can hold the state's feet to the fire is if we come together across lines of race and ethnicity and religion and custom and culture and region, et cetera, in order to create the power that emanates from a multiracial solidarity and compel the nation to do what it professes it wants to do, which is to create this nation where all of us have equal protection under the law. The third part of this book suggests that if we want to learn what this national solidarity can look like, all we have to do is look at the Black American experience. People would like to think, I think, that Black folks are sort of born into this solidarity, like it's in part of the melanin, that we just love one another and we are going to work together. This solidarity was forged in centuries of trial, centuries of work to realize freedom and liberty. And the beginning of the African American experience is essentially a disparate set of peoples from sub-Saharan Africa and sometimes through the Caribbean to here, who did not speak the same language or practice the same religions or believe the same things, but became one people because of the institution of slavery and our resistance to it and the necessity of finding solidarity to withstand the horrors of it. And that solidarity was further crystallized through the horrors of slavery and through Jim Crow. And we became one people out of many. And so if you want to see e pluribus unum, look to the 17th century experience of enslaved Africans in America and how enduring that has been in the Black experience. So those lessons include things like superlative citizenship, a concept that I call trickle-down citizenship, which is when we marry our moral demands with a national interest in order to compel the nation state to see racial progress in its interest to do. And unpack the origins and the power of Black solidarity in order to point to the ways we can establish this kind of solidarity across racial lines. And the oppressive force that necessitates this is racism. Either we address it or we risk losing this opportunity that we have to create a multiracial egalitarian democracy. There's only been one thing in the nation's history that has literally tore it in two, and that is the question of the status of Black people in this country. So we don't have to guess about the threat of racism, either the philosophical threat or the sort of the threat to our nature, or the material threat in terms of warfare or bad economics. It's on the question of race, and we have an opportunity to move the nation forward and leave a better country to posterity than the one we inherited.
This is great. I mean, listening to both of these folks, I was telling both of them before the webinar started, these are honestly two of the smartest books that I've read on these issues in a very long time. And it was a pleasure. I paid for your books out of my pocket, and I don't regret doing it. Because at the end, I felt that I was smarter and better. And here's what I think to me were distinctive from some of the conversations that we're having. And I want to invite the both of you to help us think through this. First, both books, and again, the commonality between the two, even though you're coming from different perspectives and emphasizing different things, but the commonality and the intelligence and how beautiful the books are written and your personal stories are interwoven, it's quite remarkable. But both books do focus on structure and not feelings. right? Identity plays a role, but obviously you talk about racism, you talk about solidarity. So identity has to play a role, but both are really interested in policy and structure and change. Yet a lot of the conversation that we're having about race, and both on that happens on the left and on the right. On the right, it's more of a caricature, but the conversation we're having about races seems to be much more about feelings and less about structure. So I want to invite you to, is that a fair characterization? And you could push back and say it is unfair, but the focus that both of you put on policy and structure and change, I think, is an important focus that is worth thinking about. The other part I'd like for you to expand on in particular on this notion of solidarity, because there is a debate too that is happening within the broader equality literature, which is that, look, what we really need, it's hard for people to build solidarity across difference. In part because racism pays, right? So, Heather, you start out with this by talking about the zero-sum nature, right, of racism. Racism pays. And so how do we build solidarity when people benefit from a structure and have, especially white people and particularly people with high socioeconomic status, right, benefit from the structure? How do we convince them that there is something? And Ted, you also talk about this in your book, that people will have to give something up, right, in order to accomplish the ideals that you both see as part of the American theoretical system, right? So first on structure, and then second on the possibilities of building solidarity when racism pays for folks who are in power.
So, I think two things. Yes, structure is essential, and structure is what the Black Lives Matter movement has been about, right? It hasn't been about thoughts and feelings. It's been about accountability and policy. If you look at the agenda that came out, before 2020, that the Movement for Black Lives put together in the wake of Ferguson, it is about a structural, economic, and social policy reform agenda that will materially impact the lives of Black people. If you look at what is going on, to speak politically right now, in terms of the fall off in enthusiasm and support for the Democratic Party among its base, which is African American people, it's not because people in the White House haven't said racial equity enough. It's because the party in power has not delivered on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and other reforms, including things like an end to qualified immunity, which gets 70% support. The idea that nobody should be assumed to be above the law, even if they have a badge and a gun. And then things like voting rights, which it's just it really is about substance. It really is about policy. And I'll be very clear about this. I think part of why there are two reasons why that is not always evident in the discourse. One is that there has been a desire to render in black and white, both like visually, in terms of putting it in the past, and in terms of stark moral good and bad, what racism is, and make it an individual story of bad people doing bad things so that people today can be assumed to be innocent. So there's a real sort of incentive among white folks, and others, but to make racism about individual thoughts and feelings, and to put it in the past. And then the second is that, we're just a very individualistic society. Our entire kind of lens through which we see the world is about self-care, self-improvement, self-worth, self-awareness, it's all about what we can do to make ourselves better. And, I think that is a vestige of racialized capitalism. I think it is a value that has been promoted and animated in the service of an economic agenda, but it's one that is just, it's hard to untangle all the different places where that message that the answer to problems is individual improvement is communicated, right? I can recycle all I want. I can't stop global climate change on my own. And yet, so often we are being asked not to look at the powerful, not to look at the fossil fuel lobby, to render inchoate actual behaviors that powerful people and entities are doing that create real circumstances and tragedies in our lives, and to put things on the individual and on the far less powerful individual. And so I think that's where the tension or the sort of obfuscation can come from. But absolutely, I think if you ask Black activists, if you take polls of Black Americans broadly, what is wanted, it is not actually more DEI work. It is structural change. DEI work is what's in everyone's faces because we're experiencing it in our workplaces and in our schools. But it really is about things that are the things that got people on the street last summer and that, created a sort of sea change in our culture were not just about thoughts and feelings. They really were about structures of accountability and opportunity and justice.
And I absolutely agree with all of that. The greatest trick racism ever pulled was convincing the people that it's a matter of hearts and minds and not of structures. And so, every time a white person ceases to use the N-word, the Black median household wealth does not go up by $5,000. We don't close any gaps just because people change their hearts. Changing the hearts is important because that can lead to can facilitate better public policy when you've got folks that are good or operating in good faith. But structures is where the game is, and this is how we can make demonstrable change. Brown v. Board preceded the change of hearts and people around desegregation of school or accepting the principle that separate but equal is no longer constitutional. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act preceded changed behaviors, and so structures are important. In the book, I sort of talk about the environment in which structural change can be most successful, or rather guideposts for the structural change. One of them I say is, the fulfillment of the American promise is not colorblind. It's actually color conscious. Everyone likes to quote Martin Luther King to suggest that he wanted a colorblind America. He just didn't want his children judged by the color of their skin, but he still wanted his children to be Black and accepted for their Blackness, and accepted that their Blackness did not counter or contravene their Americanness. So the fulfillment of the American promise accepts a diverse people and protects all of our rights equally, instead of suggesting that there is no longer such a thing as race, and now we're just American, so now race isn't a problem. The other thing is, instead of making the kind of racism that we can address about, again, hearts and minds, it says that racism is actually a responsibility of the state. In fact, I call racism a crime of the state, because the state has not done, it's basically been in breach of the social contract, and it has not sufficiently addressed the impacts of structural racism, and that leaves, that breach is a kind of state crime. And in this way, reframing it this way, now the onus of repair is not on white people to make Black people feel better. The onus of repair is on the state to ensure the American promise is delivered to all Americans, especially those that it's historically marginalized and those that it continues to marginalize today. So by making this the responsibility of the state, it sort of gives us the license to talk about slavery because it was the nation state that did that. It gives us license to talk about Jim Crow because it was the state that did that. And it doesn't matter that any white person living today didn't enslave folks before the Civil War. America did, the United States did, and therefore it's incumbent upon the state to make it better. So the last thing I'll say on this in terms of like guideposts for structural change is the only thing that unites 330 million people.
Before you do that,
Yeah.
can I just ask, is there a question that's come up in the chat a lot in the Q&A on what is meant by structural racism?
Mm.
So if you or Heather might say, and then you could talk about the guidepost, because I think if we can help people understand what we mean by structural racism, then we can help them with the guideposts for change. So when we talk about structural racism or systemic racism, what is it that we're talking about?
Yeah, so sort of the shorthand way of how I define it is the process in which public policy creates disparity um, through no fault through no fault of the folks subjected to the system, which is to say that structural racism doesn't require malice or forethought. Structural racism doesn't require interpersonal hatred. Structural racism produces racial inequality as a matter of living and functioning and operating within America. And so it is in our criminal justice system, it is in our housing, in our labor markets, in our education system, in our healthcare system. And even though these systems today don't operate intending to create racial inequality, the outcome of their operation produces those things. And that's sort of I think the structural racism, that's how I define it in sort of in shorthand. And I don't know if Heather, if you want to jump in on this or.
No, continue with your point about the guidepost.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so sort of this third and final aspect of this is that if we are a nation of 330 plus million folks of different nations of origin and race and ethnicity and religion and languages and customs, cultures, et cetera, the only thing that really unites us is the promise of America, is our belief in equality and liberty and the rights that the Constitution affords. And so I pull up this idea from Jean-Jacques Rousseau that was reinvigorated for America by a sociologist named Robert Bellah from Berkeley in the 60s, that suggests that there is a sort of religious quality to how to be American. If all the tenets of, any religion, just about, they have deities, then they have rituals and observances and symbols, et cetera. And if you look at the way we are American, we have the same sort of things. We've got our canon in the Declaration and the Constitution and Bill of Rights. We've got our sort of pantheon of citizen exemplars, Martin Luther King and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. We've got the rituals, the Independence Day and Memorial Day. We've got our symbols in the flag and the Statue of Liberty. So we've got all the markings of a religion, but it's not actually a religion. It is a way of expressing belonging and a desire to bring the nation or the country to the fulfillment of the ideals that are laid out in the canon. And so that's the thing that unites us. Either we all believe in equality and liberty, and we're trying to create a nation that produces that equality and liberty for all, or we don't. But that belief is the one thing that unites us all, no matter our race or again, the things that are different from us. If we take those three guideposts into consideration as we construct public policy, then we will create a nation that is better than the one we inherited.
Very helpful. Heather?
Remind me of the question that you want me to.
Well, you can jump in on any part of this, whether you want to talk about what we mean
You
by.
asked two questions at first. No, I thought Ted's answer on structural racism is great, and there are also a bunch available on the internet. And you asked a two-part question. One was about the dialectic between structure and an individual, and the second piece was.
Well, we move on to some questions from the audience. So one question that a member of the audience has asked is, what are solidarity movements current solidarity movements that you all see that give reasons for hope and that provide maybe even a blueprint for building solidarity?
Oh, it's so funny because that's what I'm doing right now. So the last chapter of the book and most of the chapters in the book end with a story of a solidarity dividend, as I defined it, people coming together across lines of race to win things that they couldn't win on their own. And right now I'm actually traveling around the country again, going back and finding more of those stories to amplify in a podcast that will be out late next spring. I think it'll be called The Sum of Us as well. There's so many examples of this. The Poor People's Campaign, which is being led by Reverend William Barber, is a campaign that picks up the mantle of the campaign that Dr. King launched and led, including with Reverend Jesse Jackson, before he was assassinated. It is a campaign that says that poverty in this country is a policy choice, is preventable, is something that impacts people of all races, and that it's going to take a movement of poor people, white, black, and brown, as they say, to overcome. And it is a movement that is focused on addressing inequality in our democracy. Dr. Reverend Barber was arrested yesterday in Washington for civil disobedience to try to get the Democrats to amend the filibuster to have 50 votes to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to ensure that there is a real functioning multiracial democracy in this country. This is really it. This is our last opportunity to ensure that for decades to come. And there's not the sense of urgency that there needs to be in Washington. And it is a campaign that says that we can rebuild the social safety net, we can raise the minimum wage, we can ensure that people have the right to housing and healthcare and transportation, and we can do so in a way that ultimately is to the benefit of all. There was a related question, Guy, about sort of concrete examples of the ways that white people might benefit from ending racism, and I try to litter those throughout the Sum of Us, because that is sort of one of the core things that I'm trying to put forward. But look at, for example, healthcare, right, where the largest group of the uninsured today are white people, and yet the majority of white Americans have been opposed to Obamacare since the beginning, and where in the places where white governors and majority white conservative legislatures have refused to expand Medicaid to allow working class people to be able to afford to see a doctor, that has disproportionately impacted people of color, but the largest share of folks has consistently been white working class folks and the white rural communities that are really suffering for not having those healthcare spending dollars and seeing hospitals close and the jobs that come along with it. I talk about the way that we need to move past a sort of racialized anti-government sentiment that's blocking action on climate change. And that's something where we do all live under the same sky. That's the name of the chapter in the book, where, yes, there's going to be a disproportionate impact of the harms of global climate change, and there already are, on people in the global south, on people in low wealth communities and environmental justice communities, sort of sacrifice zones, but it's ultimately costing all of us and will accelerate.
Thank you. Yeah, I found, when I read the book, I actually found the environmental justice chapter, we live under the same sky, really arresting, and particularly in articulating and making that point. Right, so there are a couple other questions that are raised in the chat. Ted, if you wouldn't mind, one question that is raised is, how do we build solidarity across groups of color? So your book in particular uses the Black experience, and you do know that you're not, you want to go beyond the Black-white paradigm, but it does use the Black experience as a way of framing the question and the problem of racism in the American context, as well as a way, as you just articulated very nicely now, of providing the solution, right? What does it mean for solidarity? Okay, so, but now this is, and you both are very good at talking about, this is a multiracial, multi 21st century democracy. So, how do we think about other groups, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx? What is the role here, and how does one bring in those experiences as part of the solidarity movement, especially if at bottom we're building this solidarity frame upon the Black experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately, there's not like a silver bullet answer on this is how it can be done. But here's what I would say: every time there's been a successful multiracial coalition in the United States, even before the United States was around, often the way that coalition was broken was by pulling at the racial threads within the group, which is to say, they turned groups with the different racial groups within this coalition against one another, whether it's 1676 and Bacon's Rebellion, where white folks and white indentured servants and enslaved Black folks and some Native American folks literally marched to Williamsburg and burned down the governor's mansion put there by the king and overthrew the government in order to have a fair economic policy and work opportunities and land, et cetera. And the way that coalition was broken, well, one, the leader dies from dysentery, but the other is that the crown begins to tell those white people within the coalition, if we give you this land, who's going to work it? You're going to need a labor force. And if we agree to protect that land from bordering Native American tribes, who's going to do the fighting? And suddenly white indentured servants and enslaved Black folks weren't as appealing as partners anymore when the crown offered to give some folks in the coalition material things and then put conditions on those grants on the subjugation of the very folks that had helped them accomplish things. And this goes from there all the way. We could look at the postal strike of 1970. I mean, you name me a multiracial coalition and there will be threads to pull. The other thing I would say is whenever we have failed as even in our most unifying moments, at least the moments where we're perceived to be most unified, like after Pearl Harbor or after 9/11, the thing that never goes away is racism. Pearl Harbor comes, we go to war, we incarcerate Japanese Americans simply because of their race. But we were also at war with Germany and Italy, and guess what? Germany and Italy, and we didn't go around rounding up German Italians or German Americans and Italian Americans. It was a race issue. After 9/11, there was this moment of national unity and we're going to stand together and terrorism won't win. But if you were Arab in America, if you worshiped that mosque in America, if you were a Sikh in America, you were subjected to more hate crimes. After COVID, this is a moment to come together. But if you were an Asian American, hate crimes rose. And so even in the moments where we're supposed to come together to battle these things in a multiracial way, whether it's a military thing or a public health response, racism rears its ugly face to dismantle the power of the people to compel the government to do a thing or to go further than it wants to go. And so either we find this multiracial solidarity or we will be pitted against one another and none of us will gain or will realize the kind of nation or the kind of governance that we expect from the country.
Excellent, thank you. Heather, do you want to get in there? Or do you? Okay, so here's, no worries. So here's a question that I think underlies a number of different sets of questions I'd like to hear both of you on. So to what extent, so the books are very eloquent and you both are great here too, just now, Ted, and earlier, Heather, on talking about how racism distorts our understanding of the problem, all right? Now then, the question is, all right, how do we understand the solution? And to what extent is race the way to frame the solution? Or to what extent are we talking about universalist approaches to public policy solutions? So again, you both are very great and very clear and clean that no, this is not a colorblind vision, very clear and clean about the centrality of race, and in particular, how race forces us and creates a framework in which we don't appreciate the nature of our public policy problems and the commonalities that we have in common. All right, but now focusing on the solution, to what extent then are we moving from a race frame, or to what extent is it still central in helping us think through the set of solutions that where you would like to see us go?
Great question. So I think we basically have two different types of problems that we need to deal with. One are problems of where history is showing up in our wallets, right? Where we have families today paying or earning interest on explicitly racist decisions. The racial wealth divide. Black families having less than 15 cents on the dollar on average for every dollar that white families have. Black college graduates having less wealth on average than white high school dropouts, right? That's something where if you don't understand the problem, if you don't understand what caused the problem, then you actually can't really address the solution. A universal solution to that is not, that doesn't cognize the role, the explicit, and doesn't admit and teach all of Americans about the explicitly racist decisions that made that a problem, won't get us there, right? You cannot just address the racial wealth divide without being very race conscious. On the other hand, then you have other kinds of problems, like the fact that we don't have universal health care and universal child care, and things where I argue if we had a uniformly white nation, we would have had long ago. And that is an area where, that's sort of the second type of problem, where racial resentment and racism as refracted through public, the sort of drained pool politics I write about in the book, suggests that in fact we could just create a universal program. The people who are designing that program need to understand how different communities are situated differently, and therefore not one size won't fit all, right? If you have mixed status families, if you have families where getting the child care benefit or daycare requires some other transportation equity or educational equity that is necessary, where you're going to do a universal program and then see all of a sudden Black and brown and indigenous communities are not actually availing themselves of the child care even though they want to, right? So you need to be race conscious in the design, but I don't think that in so many of the areas where we simply need to play cleanup and catch up, I think that those don't need to be marketed in a racial way. I don't think that they need to be, I don't even think they need it. I don't even think the racism that has helped us not achieve them even needs to be called out, in a mass way. It was helpful to me in the book, but I don't think that's how we market universal childcare, is with a racial lens.
Ted? Thank you, Heather. It's great.
Yeah, and so the race conscious policy created the race problems we have today. And it's because if you were white in America, pre-Civil War, pre-Jim Crow, you had a different American experience because the policy was explicitly race conscious and that it wanted to prefer you, favor you, privilege those folks over those who were left out. And so the remedy to previously racist policy that was race conscious for white folks is not colorblind policy, but it is also race conscious in order to remedy those that had been left behind for so long. So the solution must be race conscious. And it just makes good sense. Like if you have a community of white children in Appalachia whose educational outcomes lag behind the nation's, in a community of Black children in Chicago whose educational outcomes lag behind the nation's, a universal solution doesn't work. They're different people, different histories, different sets of problems and challenges, rural, urban, again, regional histories and connections, et cetera. So why give the same solutions to people who come to, who though they have maybe a similar set of outcomes, don't have a similar set of challenges or paths to the issues that created these outcomes. So being conscious and cognizant of these differences just makes for smarter policy. It's just a better and more efficient way of doing things. And the last thing I'll say on this is that if we think about solutions in a color conscious way, then the racial resentment begins to spike because people start wondering, well, they got this and I didn't get this, so now it's unfair, it's not just. But some of that's because we have kind of self-segregated ourselves in where we live, which leads to the kind of the schools that our kids go to, the sort of our local communities. And we now don't have the kind of social contact that solidarity requires. And so we have to get to know one another. And once we know one another better, once we become civic friends instead of democratic strangers in America, then when we employ race-conscious policy to meet people's needs where they are, the jealousies are tempered some, because we will be less susceptible to the divisive appeals of why we don't have the kind of country we want. When the demagogues and others say the reason your America isn't what you think it is because that group over there, when you don't know anyone in that group, that appeal tends to work with you. And so increased social contact, and whether that's kind of national service programs or deliberative democracy convenings or sort of institutional reforms, all of those things need to happen so that we know one another better. And then we'll be, I think we'll have the temperament required to really support color conscious policy in a way that doesn't further divide us.
This is great. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to give you the heads up that, all right, you'll have your last shot, your parting shot. What is it that beyond the buy these great books, which I think the 200 people on the call should absolutely do, what is the parting shot you want to leave us with? I like the way you ended, Ted, because part of what I was going to ask was I think there is a tension between solidarity and race consciousness with respect to the remedy. And perhaps though we can have targeted without it always being race conscious, right? So we can target in ways that are to the particular geography or location if the goal is to minimize racial resentment and to build solidarity. Okay, but your parting shots, what are the things that you would like to leave us with? You've edified us for this past hour, but this is our chance to close. So tell us what are the lessons? What is that you want to leave us with?
I would just say
no. I'm going to let you have the last word, Ted.
Very good.
Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you to the Ash Center. Thank you to the audience. There's been a lively debate that I haven't been able to keep up with in the chat. Just to say that right now, in a way that there is a very clear line between Charlottesville, January 6th, and these attacks on honest education across the country, and the bans of history, the canceling of Dr. King and Ruby Bridges, the closing arguments in an election about Beloved by Toni Morrison being something that should be banned from a curriculum. These are terrifying times. They're terrifying times for intellectuals. They're terrifying times for our children who are already living in the America that we're becoming. They're part of a generation where there's no racial majority, and they need us to get out of their way and teach them about how we got to the place where we are today and stop lying to them. And I know that I don't have to convince anybody who's on this Zoom that that's the case, but I do have to convince you to speak out. And I do have to convince you to be in solidarity with educators and children across the country and parents who are under attack. And so take one action, whether it's writing to your local school board, it's, writing to your member of Congress to make it clear that this will not stand in the United States of America, these attacks on honest education and these bans on true history and true empathetic learning.
Yeah, amen to that. And thank you, Heather and Guy and the Ash Center for this. I would just say, remain optimistic. It's with all the horrible news around us, it can sometimes be tough to hang on to the optimism and the faith that tomorrow might be better. But I often think of, Black folks who were enslaved, Native Americans who were dispossessed of their land, immigrants from around the world who were treated unfairly here, and all of these marginalized groups still managed to stick it out and demand a inclusion into America. And so if enslaved Black folks manage to remain optimistic and faithful and stay strong, who am I to sort of give up and say, this is too hard, maybe this thing isn't going to work. So if the generations that came before us that lived in a worse America than we have today managed to stick it out and fight for a better one, then we've got to pick up the baton and the inspiration to continue to do the same. If folks are looking for action items to do like tomorrow, I would say go to places, and this is easy especially for Black folks, but go to places where you're not in the majority. Go put yourself in situations where you have to interact with people that you would never meet otherwise. Because if you do not create those relationships or those contacts, it's going to be very difficult to establish any kind of solidarity with someone who's out beyond your immediate social circle. And without that solidarity, we just cannot create the country that we want and the country that we hope to leave behind.
Dr. Johnson, Ms. McGhee, you both are brilliant, amazing. This was very inspiring, wonderful book projects. Thank you to our audience who stuck with us the whole hour, basically. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Miles, who organized this at the Ash Center, who hosted it. And I hope everyone have a great, wonderful rest of their evening. Take care and be well.